All right, welcome back. This is going to be Chapter 5, Lecture 5, State Theory and the Rise of the Regulatory State. So, this is by Daryl Jarvis. Section 1, the introduction. The institutionalist approach is generally a macro level approach to policymaking that sort of gets its roots in like Max Weber, right? Weberian bureaucratic work. And institutionalists often see the state as a single entity and as the most important actor in policymaking, right? And this is, I would say, probably the traditional approach. This is probably the most common approach. Um, but there are idiosyncrasies, nuances, and there are other approaches which we will talk about as we move through this unit. Okay, section 5.2, theorizing the regulatory state, power, structural orientations, capacities towards a typology. So many theorists have been lamenting the decline of the state, basically since, I don't know, the 1970s ish, maybe a little later. This begs the question why? Why are many theorists, I would even say most theorists, sort of lamenting and saying that the state is declining across the developed world, basically. So a couple different reasons, right? So neoliberalism and globalization, like we talked about earlier, are sort of watering down in many ways domestic governance power. You also have declining and seemingly spiraling trust in institutions across the Western world. There are very few exceptions. Maybe the Scandinavian countries are still sort of doing well, but for the most part, governments aren't trusted. Their institutions aren't trusted. Their politicians aren't trusted. The bureaucracies aren't trusted. The courts are not trusted. And it's getting worse and worse every time you turn around. Okay, um, international affairs, missing with domestic politics, like we talked about. Touches on that neoliberalism stuff. The rise of social media, right? And the degradation of, I don't know, facts, context. Uh, Another part is like the legitimation of just random talking heads. It seems like if someone has a camera on their face, you trust them. I see the irony here. Um, but just be careful about that sort of thing. There are a lot of morons who just love to hear themselves talk. We also have this issue of the race to the bottom, right? So this wasn't only a criticism of like southern states in the United States. This is also a criticism of the global taxing structure, right? Where there is an argument to be made, I guess, that domestic governments are unable to raise enough resources, especially from the wealthy and from corporations, from their tax base, because there is a competition to offer lower and lower and lower tax rates to the wealthy and corporations if they will simply move, right? And there are even a lot of games that get played by the biggest companies on earth, right? Energy companies like Exxon and Chevron and BP, technology companies like Google and Apple, and I don't know, what is it called now, Meta, where they shift, you know, where things are made and where their profits are derived, and all of these things. And Ireland is a really good example of one of these tax havens, right? And so this is, at least the argument is, this is also degrading state capacity over time. And you can see some of this stuff if you look at like the Panama Papers that got released. I guess that was about 8 to 10 years ago, right? Panama is also like a well-known tax haven, and the banks and the corporations and the government, et cetera, will not allow for the release of documents or information, whatever it might be. But some of them have slipped out from like a hacker, I guess, or somebody inside one of the banks. Um, But it's some nasty stuff, man. It's some nasty stuff where they hide their overall wealth and their assets and their profits, all of this stuff, so that they don't actually have to kick in their share of taxes. Okay, inequality and rising power of the sort of ultra wealthy, right? I mean, as the Zucker Musks of the world gather more and more dragon hordes, they gain political power too. Like, let's be real. And so, like, I already think that citizens had a difficult time being seen as part of the input process. But the more this inequality sort of spirals upward, the more that they are able to sort of purchase, sway, influence, right? Okay. And then finally, one of the points I would make is that we have increasingly powerful supranational organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and the EU that constrain the power of domestic governments and their sort of representatives to even pass particular options of policy. Let's see. Okay, finally, they kind of pivot here and they say, okay, we just talked about like the argument for the collapse of the modern state, right, or the regulatory state. Excuse me, the sort of tax and spend state, as they call it. But Majon, who is also a very famous sort of public policy analyst and researcher, says, well, hold on a second. All of the power of a state is not in its tax and spend capacity, right? Like, sure, there's an argument there, and some of it is. But what we're seeing is a shift away from the tax and spend 1950s, 60s policy of the state toward a regulatory state, like a softer approach and maybe a more effective approach where it's not only about taxation, right? Okay, that leads us to section 5.3, toward a typology of the regulatory state, modalities of government. All right. So, why does Majon say that we've shifted from the tax state to a regulatory state, or even why we should sort of shift our thinking about the state a little bit, right? And he gives five basic reasons: increasing levels of administrative decentralization, right? The state is becoming more and more fragmented into all kinds of different institutions and sub institutions, and the devolution of power back to states and localities and all of these different things, right? Number two, the breakup of unified forms of administrative control, like central bureaucracies, like we were just talking about. So they're kind of interrelated, right? Number three, the creation of single purpose regulatory units with budgetary autonomy. Again, this is tied to the other two, just different ways of sort of nuancing it. Number four, the delegation of public service delivery to nonprofit or profit agencies, right? And we've seen a lot of that basically since Reagan, right? The neoliberal model, where we are privatizing governance in a sense, right? And offering, look, the government will pony up the money for it, but we also don't want to hire and do the functional administration and all of this. We're going to outsource that to a private company, right? And sometimes this is good, and sometimes this is bad. Uh, I'll just leave it there, I guess. Okay. Number five, competitive tendering and the introduction of contractual and quasi contractual relationships where budgets and decision making powers are devolved to purchasers who, on behalf of their client group, buy services from the supplier offering the best value for money. So, this is what we were talking about earlier with like bid processing, right? There is an argument to be made that, like, when you have the government buy in bulk, you get economies of scale, first of all. When you buy a whole bunch of stuff, you better get a bit of a discount. Like, that's just how economics tends to work. Um, but also, governing government expenditures can be arguably and theoretically made better and more effective through a competitive bidding process, right? And so all of these things are sort of tied together, right? But these are sort of his core arguments about look, the government has shifted to a new direction, vision, philosophy to try to make things a little bit more on the ground and closer to the citizens, a little bit more decentralized, like our founders probably would have argued for, and a little bit more like effective with our money by privatizing some of these things to companies that are already built to do this, and by using a competitive bidding process, right, to make our spending effective. Okay, what are the hypothesized benefits, right? So they lay out six. First, it allows these agencies, these specialized agencies, to develop expert knowledge, and this improves governance capacity in domains where there are complexities, right? So it's just about sort of building specialized knowledge rather than having one gigantic organization try to do everything at once, right? All right, number two, it theoretically depoliticizes governance, moving decision making to technicians and experts, right? Where decisions are more likely to be rendered on evidence based assessment and determination, and balancing social and economic objectives. Now, we talked about earlier, some of this is difficult, right? Because, again, I mean, arguably nobody elected these people, but there's an argument to be made for expertise. Um, it's probably good to depoliticize governance in some ways, especially given where we are now. But you know, who does the evidence assessment? What evidence are we using? What is the goal? Who's defining it? All of these things can be touchy. Okay, number three. This regulatory state provides technical expert decision makers with a little bit more autonomy, right? And it creates a little bit more space, so there's a minimization of the short term. We need something now, right, to show our voters, and also a long term vision of a project, right? So that can be helpful. That can be helpful because when everything is short, this is why we keep the Fed away from the president generally, right? Uh, because what we know from economics research is that when you're a leader of a country, like you have an incentive to just make the economy pop right now, right? And you can do that easily by just lowering interest rates and making money more available. Like, yes, you will get an economic boom. There is no doubt about it. But the mid and long term costs of that can be devastating, right? And so if you're just looking for a re-election, you make the economy pop, you drop interest rates, but then, you know, a year or a year and a half or whatever down the road, things are a mess, right? And so that can be a real problem. And in some areas of governance, right, you have to have a little bit of space to not think about like how am I going to win a vote tomorrow, right? Okay. Number four, why we've moved to the regulatory state. Um, they say freed of this short-termism or political pressures, however you might have it. The agency model improves the prospects for continuity in policy, right? Increasing certainty, which is great for economic markets, and theoretically, the efficiency of governance in whatever sector we're talking about. Okay, number five. The agency model enhances the credibility of regulatory commitments, reducing the uncertainty by removing the prospects for ministerial interference, right? And this helps to ensure that private capital is not nervous that there's going to be some expropriation or some massive change or some reform or some whatever it might be. And so the markets can plan too, right? And then finally, this is arguable, but they say agency based modalities of governance are seen to engineer high levels of legitimacy, Um, I don't know. I don't know. I would need further research, but there are certainly arguments to be made on both sides. Okay, a critique. I wanted to offer a critique, right? Because they sort of make this regulatory state pretty shiny in their presentation of it, right? But there are some critiques to be had. They weren't elected. So, arguably, again, this is undemocratic. Um, the decentralization of agencies and the fragmentation of agencies also means you tend to get a duplication of efforts, right? Which can cost money, time, personnel, effectiveness, and sometimes you even have policies at loggerheads against each other, higher costs, uh, less pooling of resources, worsened communications over agencies, right? This is exactly why we built the DHS, the Department for Homeland Security, post 9/11, because the CIA and the NSA and the FBI and all of the other like intel services you've never heard of um, were sort of hoarding their information so they could get wind or simply didn't know that the information the FBI had about domestic investigations tied to the CIA's foreign investigations. And so the 9/11 Commission report pointed out a lot of these problems, which is actually why they re centralized a lot of these things into the DHS, right? And so, again, arguments can be made. Um, there's also like this is a point that Trump makes is that it's really difficult sometimes when these bureaucrats or technicians or experts, whatever you want to call them, are sort of dug in and protected by things like the Hatch Act or the Pendleton Civil Service Act or these sorts of things, right? Where, yes, generally it's pretty easy to overturn the leadership. Say when you move from Biden to Trump, Trump can fire like, the executive and the deputies and the deputy vices or whatever, right? But generally, it's really hard to fire the core of these institutions, right? And so you can change the leadership, and the leadership can be like, hey, let's do things differently. But the philosophy inside the institution is very unwilling to change sometimes, right? And so this can be really difficult to get actual reform in when a new administration and a new ideology or a new coalition in I want to say monarchist, but that's not what I'm trying to say. Parliamentary systems. Uh, it can be a problem, right? Okay. Interagency competition for jurisdiction and resources, right? So touched on a little bit, like I was talking about with the Department of Homeland Security, but agencies, the more fragmented they become, the more competitive they become, right? Because there are only like budgets are zero sum, right? Like, your gain is my loss, and vice versa. Um, and so there can be competitions, there can be undermining of other institutions, there can be fights about who gets this policy or what, which can become a problem too. There are difficulties of accountability. So this ties into that democratic issue that I said earlier. Who do you hold accountable? If your if your House member or your senator or whatever passes a bill and then it gets completely bastardized by the sort of institutions and the administrative bureaucracy as they set their rules around the law, right? Whose fault is that? And whose intent was built in? And all of these sorts of questions, right? Which can become problematic because how do you hold bureaucrats accountable if they're not actually enforcing the laws the way that the representatives wanted to, or if they are not implementing the laws in the way that the representatives meant for them to be implemented, right? Um, okay, that's enough. I will see you for the next one. Thank you for being here. This was chapter 5.